everyone so much for being here. I'm extremely excited. So my talk is titled Title IX at 50. This year, as probably many folks know, is the 50th anniversary of Title IX, and I'm so thrilled about that. So the photo that I chose to start off the presentation, if we were all sitting here together, I would ask you, if you know who these folks are and, where we might be connecting with them. But since we're happy to be in the format that we are, I'll tell you on the right, we have Crystal Dunn, defender for the U.S. women's national team. In the middle, we have striker Lynn Williams, and to the left, we have the quite famous forward Megan Rapinoe. So this is the U.S. women's national soccer team in the process in 2019 of winning yet another Women's World Cup. So right around this exact same time, they were suing U.S. soccer for equal pay in a case that got a lot of attention. And while they used the Civil Rights Act to do that, they were very much coming from a place of Title IX when we think about sex equality and the sort of groundedness, the exposure to Title IX that they've lived with their entire lives, and the expectation that, optimally we all have about how women who excel in school and work should be treated. So I wanted to launch in looking at them. All right, so to just tell you a little bit about Title IX. So I wanted to start off by just looking at the text. So the full name of the law, Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. So no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So it's a short piece of policy, right? But it's had a profound impact on the country for 4 generations of folks. And on the one hand, it's a sweeping policy, but it's also affected millions of us in very personal ways. So I wouldn't, for example, be a professional historian, fortunate enough to speak with you all without it. It's almost certain. But again, in a more comprehensive sense, as an anti-discrimination policy, it's reverberated far beyond schools into all aspects of our national life. So in my time today with you, I'm going to be taking a 3-part approach. Just want to quickly go over that. So first, I'm going to introduce the law's text and meaning, and we started that process. So next, I'm going to be making a historical argument that Title IX hugely expanded Americans' opportunities, but it also falls short of its potential for change. And then finally, we're going to examine Title IX's historical evolution. All right, so as I move through this presentation, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to be using 3 kind of organizing ideas or lenses to think about Title IX. So academics, sports, and sexual safety. All right, so that said, I'm happy to talk about any other aspects of the law, answer any questions that folks might have as well. All right, so a couple basics about Title IX. So when was Title IX sort of made permanent? So Richard Nixon signed Title IX on June 23rd of 1972. So this June was really exciting for a lot of people, the 50th anniversary. All right, so what does Title IX do exactly? So it requires schools that receive any government money to treat all sexes and gender identities equally. So it's a pretty big group of people this affects. So public schools and most private schools. To get a little more granular about that, the coverage is really extensive. So Title IX applies to more than 17,000 school districts, more than 5,000 post-secondary schools. And so this includes everything from trade schools, 2 to 4-year colleges and universities, and academic affiliate programs, so like medical residencies, for example. So we've also got charter schools, museums, for-profit schools, libraries, and any kind of program or agency funded by the Department of Education. Okay, so who? So all persons and all humans who are parts of campus, anyone on campus, anyone related to campus is covered by Title IX. Okay, so where does Title IX apply? So not just on the physical campus, but areas that may be off campus but are connected to it by people or by organizations. So for example, maybe by a club. All right, and then how does it work? Who's responsible for it? So the responsibility for Title IX comes out of educational institutions and the federal government, right? And so what it does is it's, charged with preventing sex discrimination. Okay. All right, and so we're going to get to some fun images here in a minute, but just one or two more of these text slides. So what am I arguing here? What should we do about Title IX? So I think Title IX has been really fascinating. It's been both incredibly effective and sadly unfulfilled. So in banning sex discrimination, Title IX has completely changed American education. So it's extended new opportunities to millions of people in schools because it changed the law and it therefore opens up expectations and raises expectations, creates expectations of equality across sex and gender. So Title IX's created space on campus for people who have been historically excluded. Their children and grandchildren now expect, and some of them take for granted, those opportunities. And the fact, Andy, like you were saying, your daughter's never lived without it, obviously that's a great thing. And on the other hand, Title IX has fallen short of its mandate because neither the federal, state, nor most schools have historically enforced the law. So in our time together today, we're going to examine the consequences of this unfulfilled potential. One striking fact that I think speaks to this is that since 1972, thousands of schools have failed to comply with Title IX, but not one institution has ever lost its Title IX funding. Okay, so again, just to quickly lay out how we're going to move forward. So Title IX history, education, and then moving beyond campus. So we're going to trace the history of the policy in three parts. So we're going to look at sex discrimination before 1972. So why is it needed? We're going to move through the process of creating the policy. And then we're going to look at just the seismic impact that Title IX has had since it was written. Okay, so moving forward, thinking about ways women were just severely discriminated against, I'm going to use some images to do that. All right, so women in sports, let's start there. So before Title IX, girls and women had exponentially fewer resources than men in competitive school sports. For women of color, in most cases, these exclusions were compounded. And so to speak to this, this is an image of the Tennessee State University Tiger Bells, the nation's #1 track and field team for much of the Cold War, with their coach, you can see on the right, Edward Stanley Temple. Before Title IX, HBCUs, Catholic colleges, and Jewish sports clubs were a uniquely competitive sports environment for women. And the reason that non-white and ethnic athletic enclaves supported sports in a way that other parts of US culture did not was largely bound up in racism. So since the late 19th century, white Protestant women had been considered both by the government and also by athletic institutions too, quote, refined or too delicate, right, to compete in sport. Whereas, again, coming from this racist lens, ethnic or racial or religious minorities were not. So for their part, on the other hand, what we see in these spaces, so HBCUs, for example, chose to foster women's sports and with the money that they had to invest and support women's sports. And you can think of basketball or here track and field as examples of supporting women in competitive anaerobic sports. All right. So even though Catholic, Black, and Jewish women's school programs were often severely underfunded, they filled Olympic rosters, the Tiger Bells especially, for over 50 years before Title IX passed. So while the Tiger Bells were world champions, their program was hugely underfunded, So for a significant percentage of the time, they were sending Olympic champions around the world. Their track didn't form a full circle, and it ended near the campus pigsty. So this image showcases the Tiger Bells trophies, but also we need to remember the reality of racism and underfunding in women's sports before Title IX. So as their coach Riley remembered, decades later, we're not talking about Title IX. We started at Title I. All right, so moving forward a little bit. So women in politics, how are they doing? So women also suffered huge disadvantages in academics, particularly in subjects, majors, or career paths that were deemed too analytical for women. So the trajectory of this woman here, Patsy Mink, a longtime U.S. House rep from Hawaii, demonstrates this dynamic. Despite excelling academically, in 1948, 12 medical schools rejected Mink, as she said, crushing her lifelong goal of becoming a doctor. But Mink pulled herself out of the ensuing depression by going to law school, only to find out that no firms outside Hawaii would hire a married woman Japanese American attorney and a woman in an interracial marriage when law firms found out that Mink was Japanese American and that her husband was white. They systematically refused to hire her. And it's from this reason that they left Chicago, where she had gone to law school, and returned to the island of Hawaii, where she began to get into local Democratic politics. All right, so you can see, I think if you can make out the brochure and the way that she frames herself, right? Local girl, housewife, and mother, that even though Mink, again, was extremely, extremely bright and had been very ambitious her entire life, when she decides to run for office, her early campaign literature had to front load a very conventionally feminine rather than competitive kind of ethos in order to best her Democratic opponent in local primaries. Okay, and then maybe we'll look at one more slide here. So women in medicine. So women who did enter medicine before Title IX did so in sex-segregated schools or outside traditional models. And the reason is that women were largely barred from mainstream medical programs in the US before Title IX basically forced schools to admit them. So in women's medical programs, not only were the students and teachers women, but the doctors often only treated female patients, as we can see here in this image from the Saturday Evening Post in 1959 on the left. All right, so women doctors also served communities as part of racial justice organizations. As an example of this, on the right, we can see women medical clinicians who flew from Chicago to rural Illinois in 1970 with a mobile medical unit called the Flying Black Medics, after racist violence had left Black residents in the small town of Cairo, Illinois, needing health care.
Professor, we have some questions coming in. I wonder if we can take a moment. And it seems like you're about to change some of the chronologies here. So talk to us a little bit.
Perfect time.
Yeah, good. This question comes from Monica. Monica's in Newark, New Jersey, and wonders how, and maybe this slide is an appropriate one to ask this question, how the role of women in World War II and other sort of domestic responses to war in the mid-20th century may have impacted this.
World War II, I think, was hugely important, and not only, did women, around 1 million women served in World War II, and one of the key ways they did this was as medics, and probably as maybe some of us are familiar with from our teaching. One thing that we saw during World War II is, as so many men who are doctors or who are involved in medicine are deployed overseas, women are able, to make real footholds. And one of the ways they do that is in medicine, but there's still this very real prejudice, I think, against women in medicine. And as far as how women are seen in science and are almost used in sort of research during World War II, women became pilots en masse for the first time in World War II, and one way that they were studied and evaluated was in terms of menstruation. So before World War II, scientists had only vague sort of ideas and understandings of how women might, be on their periods and fly planes, or how their health might sort of endure as pilots. And so when women flew in military capacities during World War II, doctors and universities discovered that in fact they did extremely really well, regardless of whether they were menstruating or not. And there were a lot of other ways that women were sort of studied and that they did excel during World War II. So I think it was important.
Yeah, thank you. This question comes from John. John is in Charleston, South Carolina, and he's curious about the role of language, in particular when you flashed up the pamphlet with Patsy Mink and noted the ways in which she described herself in this more traditional feminine role. What were some of the sort of key words or the language that women needed to use in order to, be accepted or not to trigger? And then what were some examples of words or names or ways that they describe themselves that might be problematic?
Women, I think, were very, very careful, particularly if they wanted to, move into new spaces and sort of, carve out opportunities for themselves before Title IX. They were very careful, oftentimes, to describe themselves as feminine, as girlish, and very carefully to sort of portray themselves as heterosexual and sexually appropriate. And so explaining that you had a boyfriend or that you were in a relationship, that you were engaged to a man or you were married, like you're a housewife. I think that was something women saw very effective. So all of those kinds of markers and wording, I think, was very important. And one way that we can see this is the Tennessee Tiger Bells, the track team I started off with. I think their coach was very, very conscious of framing them in a feminine way, given the racism and the sexism that women athletes faced. And so he forced all of his athletes to wear makeup when they competed. They weren't allowed to talk to media until they had put on lipstick. And when he talked to media about them, he was careful to call them girls. And he pointed out that none of them had, as he said, any trouble getting boyfriends. So there's a very clear layout about these things.
Right. Great. Thank you. This question comes from Carly. Carly's in Washington, D.C. And maybe as an extension of that question, the last question, how were women perceived in this context if they're single versus being married? What role did marriage have in this framework?
It's really interesting. I think that on the one hand, marriage signaled a kind of maturity that could, mean that a woman had potential to do things like manage an office or, multitask. But on the other hand, and we see this during World War II as well, one thing that causes concern for many, I think, men and employers or schools, like let's say graduate programs, about a married woman is there's this strong feeling she should be home with her children, right? So marriage can be a real liability for someone who's seeking an opportunity in an educational space or elsewhere. And so I think that someone who's single wouldn't be facing that particular challenge. But on the other hand, a woman during the Cold War, especially the early Cold War, a woman who's single, I think does feel a lot of pressure to sort of frame herself as extremely feminine, as gender appropriate, and non-threatening in many ways in social aspects. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Last question before we move on. This question goes to Jim. Jim is just outside of Chicago, Illinois, and he wonders if you could. This may just be a simple list, but what were the sports available to women, generally speaking, before 1972? You mentioned track and basketball. Were there others?
Yeah. Let's see. So basketball is really fascinating before 1972 because women were allowed to play and it was very popular, but they had to play half court. They weren't allowed to get physical at all. So there were very restrictive rules about passing, dribbling, and you couldn't run from one side of the court to another because it was assumed that you could have a heart problem or that you could strain yourself, or really just that women could become too passionate on the basketball court, and that this could upset their psyches or make them hysterical. And so, I mean, which is wild, right? But the interesting thing is that if you watch footage of those games or you read accounts, the women were really aggressive, very passionate about the play. And anyone who's ever seen, I think, men play a sport or competitive sport knows that, women hold no bar on, passion and emotion in an athletic space.
Yeah.
So it's not like men aren't like highly emotional when they play sports. So, and, weren't in the early 20th century. So it's really a specious argument. But where women do have a lot of success in sport, it tends to be in individual sports. And I think
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, because, it's less visibly competitive, but also sports that are kind of artistic. So swimming, I think, even though it's kind of, requires so much strength, it's and speed, it's seen as sort of graceful and beautiful. And something like tennis or figure skating also fits very nicely
Mm-hmm.
with this at the time, like idea that women's sports should be graceful rather than strenuous.
I mean, it really seems to be such a weird contrast of demure femininity in the mid 20th century with the qualities of competition, which is aggression and passion and sort of losing control in a weird way, sweating.
Yeah.
I mean, all the things that go into winning. And it's interesting, and I wonder what that conflict was between the need to win and the need to be calm or contained.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that in some ways, it's before Title IX. There's this fear that if women, became too deeply enmeshed in like a career in law, right, or a career in business administration, like these were the sort of hurly-burly places where, in theory, a woman might not understand like the math or the nuts and bolts, but like let's say she did, and what if she, became, kind of lost her self-control, right? That this is somehow like inherently bad and dangerous
Right.
for a woman's spirit. And like underlying that argument, I think, is like, what does that say about men and society more broadly if, we define these things as male or men's qualities, but women have them? Then
Right.
that throws us into a conundrum, right?
Right. Well, Professor, let's go ahead and move on, but I do want to bring a comment that Carolyn has shared. Carolyn is a retired educator and noted that when she played basketball before 1972, she hated the rules because you could only dribble 3 times. 3 times was the limit. So hard to imagine.
I know, right?
Well, thank you. Let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll take some more questions soon.
Okay, sounds great. So let's see. So now I want to move into thinking about the nuts and bolts of Title IX, how it's so profound and how it gets created. So kind of moving from that moment that Carolyn was just talking about, moving forward into the space where the law becomes reality. So we're going to talk about the creation of Title IX. So, and as we've seen, right, women were really broadly locked out of key educational opportunities into the 1960s. So one thing that changes is that the civil rights movement and the women's liberation struggle have both gained, really significant credence by the late 1960s. And women who have been facing discrimination in education for decades began to observe these movements, to live through them, and to understand what they're going through in education as systematic sex discrimination due to their sort of exposure to these social justice movements. And especially almost every other group at this time is looking to the leadership and the example of the civil rights movement. So in this context, there's a couple key players. So one of these is the woman on the left. So 41-year-old mother, Bernice or Bunny Sandler, who we see holding the ERA Yes sign, which stands for Equal Rights Amendment, played a pivotal role in demanding sex equality in education. Sandler was rejected from academic jobs for, as her academic advisor said, coming on too strong for a woman in the late 1960s. She brought a class action suit against over 200 universities after realizing that President Lyndon Johnson had signed an executive order that prohibited sex discrimination in federal contracts, which most schools have. So on the right, you can see Sandler there, who has kind of the two-tone hair in the middle. You can see her working with other feminists, including U.S. Senator Birch Bayh, to push for the bill that would become Title IX. So Sandler's cause resonated with a number of folks in Congress, and one of the most important was Patsy Mink, who we've already spent a little time with. So by this time, Mink is the first woman of color and first Asian American woman in Congress. So along with fellow U.S. Representative Edith Green and Senator Birch Bayh, who we just met, Mink shepherded Title IX through Congress to stop sex discrimination in education. So most legislators at the time didn't foresee big change when they sent Title IX to President Richard Nixon with bipartisan support to sign. They assumed instead that it would just affect academics. And if you think of the experiences that Sandler or Mink had, they had kind of a reasonable expectation that what would be remedied was, the sort of crises of like women trying to get into grad school, for example. So I just want to mention a little bit about how Title IX works, the structure of it here. So Title IX's architects modeled the bill on the 6th and the 7th titles of the Civil Rights Act, which really opens up in 1964, hugely opens up rights and liberties across the United States from people who had previously been denied those rights. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for example, forces private entities to racially integrate, right? And there's a number of other really important things that it does. But it did omit sex and education from protected categories. So Title IX is it's a part of those education amendments in 1972, which also addressed student loans and busing. Okay, so we're going to move on now to someone who maybe some of us are familiar with. So across academia and sports, Title IX transformed education in the 1970s. So girls and women rushed into educational avenues historically denied them and really gave lives, they did so, to the old saws that women didn't study chemistry or play full court basketball because they lacked the desire or the ability. Within 5 years, girls and women had made significant gains in educational access. But in schools, national media, and governors' offices, sports very quickly became the most controversial part of the law. So why is this? Why did sports draw so much attention so quickly? Simply put, because the sex gap was the most egregious area in education in sports. So girls comprised just 7% of high school athletes in 1971, while collegiate women received only 2% of overall athletic budgets and almost no scholarships. So in this context, women athletes celebrated the new law even if they weren't in college at the time. So Billie Jean King is one of those people. Her routing of self-proclaimed, quote, male chauvinist pig, Bobby Riggs, in the 1973 event Battle of the Sexes, symbolized the new power of sport in the feminist movement, even though Title IX had come too late for King to benefit from the law as a student herself. So King, as one of women's sports' most visible sort of celebrities and activists, also founded the first women's professional sports organization, which still exists today and is called the Women's Sports Foundation. Okay, so moving to an international kind of dimension here. So U.S. leaders capitalized on the new depth that Title IX added to American sports, and diplomacy became part of that interest that they had. So, as president in the mid 1970s, Gerald Ford closely tracked the prospects of elite athletes, especially in track and field, which at the time was still seen as an extremely popular, very, very glamorous sport. So he tracked the prospect of these competitors because of their importance in cultural diplomacy during the Cold War, particularly with the Soviet Union and with China. So as part of the process of continuing to, quote, open China, which Richard Nixon had initiated during his term, Ford sent the first sex-integrated Team USA rather than sending separate men's or separate women's teams to a diplomatic exhibition in China in 1975. Title IX was a critical part of developing elite women's and men's athletic teams together to represent the United States abroad. All right, so this is a spread from Sports Illustrated, and I just really liked these images. Ed Temple, who we've already seen at Tennessee State, was one of the primary coaches for this trip, as well as multiple Olympic teams, and his own accounts of this describe all kinds of sort of fascinating interactions between male and female athletes in China as they traveled around to different cities. But you can see here that both the men and the women are prominent players and are getting a lot of attention.
Professor, I've got a quick question I'd like to insert. Being Sports Illustrated is obviously a pretty huge deal. To your knowledge, were there any publications, whether it's newspapers or commentary magazines, that had a negative view or portrayal of this same event?
That is a great question. So I haven't come across any primary source evidence that frames this particular event negatively, but I think there were many hawks, I guess we could say, but there were many conservatives on the sort of harder right than Nixon and the harder right than Ford who were concerned about the sort of increasingly cordial and open relationships with the kind of détente or the sort of thawing out of foreign policy with China and with the USSR at this time. And so the process of sort of cultural diplomatic exchange and increasing communication and friendship between athletes, I think that might have been, an aspect of foreign policy that would sort of, be concerning as a very sort of public, pop culture-y visual way, sort of celebrating the increasing connection between communist and capitalist countries. But yeah, I haven't read anything that particularly criticizes this event.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. So at this point, I want to again shift us a little further forward in time, and I'll quickly move us through some kind of big moments as we move from this revolution of the 1970s to a more kind of complex relationship with Title IX in the 1980s, and in some ways one of contestation or resistance, a kind of backlash. So in terms of sport, if we think about how sport had traditionally been very carefully divided between boys and girls, one thing that in some ways is really solidified by the 1980s is sex segregation in sport. While we did just look at that really interesting image of kind of elite athletes abroad competing as one Team USA, in most sort of youth sports and college sports, we tend to get the very careful separation of males and females in sport rather than any kind of more integrated model. And the late 1970s and the early 1980s become a real flashpoint for deciding that hard line. So in the 70s, we have just a massive influx of girls and women into sport, and the NCAA becomes a really interesting player here. So in the 1970s, the NCAA had been very, very concerned about Title IX, basically gutting men's revenue-producing sports, and in particular attacking football. And the NCAA had supported efforts in Congress to basically exempt football from Title IX and to protect football at all costs, and these efforts failed and Title IX stayed intact. But so the NCAA has a very sort of volatile relationship with Title IX and basically with the idea of women's sports being well funded into the early 1980s. But one moment that really shows us how far women's sport has come is in the early 1980s. The NCAA executives who are running the show there take a hard look at women's sport. They realize that women's sport is starting to make money. It's incredibly popular. Around 80% of Americans support Title IX by the time Reagan comes into office. And so what they decide to do is basically take over college women's sport. And there had been other smaller leagues that had formed earlier on that were sort of a less competitive model and emphasized more of teamwork. And the NCAA just gradually wrested control from those more organic women's leagues and groups. And the way that it did it was basically by offering NCAA championships and offering to put those women athletes on television. And within 2 years, all women's college sport had transferred over to the NCAA. So we can see this real shift in power and control over women's sport, as some kind of indicator that women's sport is becoming increasingly popular. So that's going on right around this shift into the Reagan administration. And one other thing that we see as colleges become kind of resigned to, to complying with Title IX, a lot of them begin to hire women's administrators, which is a big step forward. But the way that they do it tends to sort of steer women out of power. So rather than considering women for directorships or executive positions or even coaching in combined athletic programs, most schools, so let's take the University of Tennessee, for example, like a big sports school, they create an entirely separate women's athletic department rather than simply allowing women to come in to the mainline program, share their funding. Instead, they put the women across the street in a completely different building and kind of shunt them across. So that real segregation continues. And lastly, one thing that happens in sports that still very much continues today, and we should just be aware of, is that by the late 1970s, schools have 3 ways that they can comply with Title IX in sport. So first, you can comply as a school if your athletes are represented proportionally with the amount of the students by sex that you have at your school. So for example, right now, there are a higher proportion of girls than boys going to college. And so that has made the proportionality in sport question really, really interesting, right? So what's the proportion of athletes at your school? Does it accurately represent the student population? Okay, so if you don't want to comply that way, there are 2 others. So you can show that you have a long-term continuing practice of maintaining equality in athletics or of supporting women and girls in sports. Right? And then lastly, if you don't want to do either of those things, then you can show you have a current practice of responding to athletes' interests in sport and abilities in sport. So if you have a number of elite athlete gymnasts, for example, and they desire to form a gymnastics team, then a school is obligated to allow them to form that team. Okay, so during this transition into the 80s, this period of pushback, we are also just going to briefly look at academia. So here again, there's just an exponential growth of women students. But again, we get a kind of pushback once we get to the higher levels. So for example, there is just a massive exponential growth of women who attend medical school. But where we start to see a more troubling trend is once we move into residency programs and once we look at professorships or department chairs, there tends to be a real sort of pattern of derision, of discrimination, of harassment that starts to slow women's progress the higher up the levels go, and it's very unlikely into the 80s that schools will hold their programs to account and deploy Title IX to stop that kind of harassment. Okay, and lastly, one thing that does change is in the late 1970s, schools began being subject to sexual safety claims. So the very first time that students sue a school when they're sexually harassed is in 1977 in a case called Alexander v. Yale. Okay, so that was a lot of me chatting, but I just wanted to lay out the basic landscape of the late 20th century in terms of Title IX and what those big shifts are. Okay, so I'm going to move through some images here. So one of the more charismatic presidents, I think, of the late 20th century is Ronald Reagan. And in the 1980s, as probably many of us know, he's very successful at articulating frustration with what he would call government overreach, as well as any kind of overt feminist activism. So for this reason, he tries to tamp down any progress that's made in terms of Title IX in a number of ways. So one of these ways is that his administration works to weaken the Department of Education, the Department and Departments of Civil Rights as they support Title IX. So, for example, he replaces a longtime women's educational expert in administration with a state member of conservative anti-ERA activist Phyllis Schlafly's longtime sort of grassroots women's and men's, but longtime conservative group, the Eagle Forum. All right, so he makes that switch. All right, and so one other way we see this is in the Supreme Court. So in 1984, in a major decision, the Supreme Court passed down the decision Grove City College v. Bell. And this decision holds that schools were no longer required to apply Title IX to their entire institutions, just programs that received specific federal monies. So students' financial aid, for example. And previously, the fascinating thing, something that's extremely important about Title IX is that if anything about a college is funded, Title IX applies to the entire institution. So if one student receives financial aid, the entire institution is held to Title IX. So Grove City College v. Bell, Grove City College is an extremely conservative school. They dislike Title IX very strongly. And this case severely undercuts the effectiveness of Title IX. So we can see that there's a channel of deep resentment around Title IX's application, and indeed the mandate of sex equal treatment very broadly. But something that is quite different is that the decision is overturned by the late 1980s. And one thing I think this shows us is that Americans have broadly accepted women athletes in specific contexts, just as they've become used to seeing women in business spaces, right? And become sort of accustomed to more prominent roles of women in politics, in finance, in sort of popular national life. All right, so 3 slides, I think, that I want to use show the sort of increasing pride and definitely the importance that Americans sort of feel about women in public life by the time we get to the 1980s. So the first, some people may remember this moment or be familiar, but this athlete is Joan Benoit Samuelson, a New Englander. So Samuelson grew up on the East Coast. She went to Bowdoin, where she trained with boys, somewhat self-conscious about being a runner. She oftentimes trained on back roads, but she embraced competitive long-distance running at a time when the sport was relatively new, and or at least relatively new as a popular mass sport, and relatively new for women. So she won the Boston Marathon, as you can see on the left, and she won in the very first U.S. women's, the very first Olympic marathon. The first year the marathon was held for women was in 1984 in Los Angeles. So one thing I think that she does speak to, so she's an incredible point of pride, and she's an amazing athlete, and she's one of the first athletes as a woman to be sponsored by Nike. But also as a petite white woman, she speaks to a sort of increasing embrace of white upper middle class, kind of a boom of runners nationwide in the 1980s, right? And she fits into kind of this model of an athlete that Americans respond to relatively easily. Okay, so another athlete who is very popular in the 1980s and also calls into the conversation different dynamics for us is Florence Griffith Joyner, or FloJo. So Joyner would have almost certainly been at an HBCU, likely Tennessee State, but perhaps elsewhere, almost for certain before Title IX, because of the difficulty of, on the one hand, finding an elite track program outside of an HBCU network, but also as an elite Black woman athlete, just the likelihood that she would have gained the credence and sort of been allowed to thrive as an athlete outside of the HBCU network is just not as likely. But after Title IX, we see her thrive at Cal State Northridge and then at UCLA. So she becomes, in the 1980s, the fastest woman in the world. But we see during her career that she fights accusations of doping. She's accused many times of being mannish. And because of her physique, because of her speed, she's just almost impossible for many in the media and many in popular culture to even sort of fully process as a woman, due to racism and the sort of specter of women in sports becoming too powerful, becoming too fast. It's literally almost impossible for people to believe that she's as skilled as she is. So moving forward and thinking again about these ideas. So in the 1980s, someone else who becomes really important in terms of Olympic gains is Debbie Thomas. So Thomas was a Stanford grad and U.S. Olympic figure skater who faces racist comments about, again, her muscularity and her appropriateness. But she's a skater, right? So again, those kind of hyper feminine, delicate, sort of pixie-like sports we talked about earlier. So she's in figure skating, and then she becomes an orthopedic surgeon to the notoriously closed off, seen as a kind of hyper masculine field. So she really epitomizes the impact of Title IX in these multiple ways, even as she's dubbed, quote, difficult, quote, too competitive, and as a, quote, perfectionist as a surgeon. So she faces some of the sort of classic call out, complaints about women in the medical space. All right, but I really like her because she, is just sort of a hyper performer in sport and the same in academia.
Professor, let's take a moment. I've got some questions that are starting to come in, and this might be a good time to bring at least a few of them to your attention. The first one actually comes from Cynthia. Cynthia's in Richmond, Virginia, and I think it was the last couple of slides that may have inspired this question. And it's a question around the collision of Title IX with celebrity, with beauty, with media, with television, and sort of the visual representation. Talk to us a little bit about those qualities and the ways that they both became problems for Title IX, but also ways that they were incorporated.
Sure. Sorry. So the ways that beauty and celebrity and sport.
Yeah, just
fit in
right.
tension?
Just that whole, exactly that whole collision of FloJo's a great example of celebrity, of sass, of being a personality, of being comfortable and authentic, and issues of concepts and qualities of beauty that are now emerging in the early 90s. Talk to us some about that.
Okay, absolutely. So I think we see such a leap forward and a transition from, the coach in the mid-1960s who, is so concerned about his athletes seeming appropriate or worried what might happen to them if they don't seem hyper feminine or kind of demure, despite the fact that they're so explosive on the track, that he really regiments the way that they can look and who they can talk to and how they can sound. So just 25 years later, we're in this completely different dynamic where we do have someone like Florence Griffith Joyner, who I don't have any of those pictures here because I wanted to focus on her work at college and then being in the Olympics. But she's quite famous for her sort of flamboyant, beautiful outfits that she competed in when she was in different meets. So the one-legged tights, the nails, the makeup, and just really creating her own style as a celebrity. And there are numerous other athletes who've done similarly, and I think some of them, admiring her and doing so as a kind of callback to the way that she worked. But yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, I think something they may have been trying to do is draw attention to certainly themselves, and this is the era where women are, starting to be considered for athletic sponsorships and very much kind of trying to carve out a financial career in sport that could possibly sustain them. So I think part of it is practical. And then part of it, I think, is this larger picture of, media exposure for women's sport, right? And claiming space for women to be seen as serious athletes, but ironically, using a kind of very playful, dramatic, kind of cinematic celebrity aesthetic to do so, and also to sort of claim your individuality.
Yeah, absolutely. As a follow-up question, this comes from Molly. Molly's in Scottsdale, Arizona, and wonders if you could talk some about the role of sponsorship. You mentioned Nike as being one of the early sponsors, but talk to us a little bit about just the role of corporate sponsorship.
So corporate sponsorship was almost impossible for women in the 1970s, as probably many of us, or maybe some of us know. Billie Jean King, because no sponsorships for women athletes existed, she created the Virginia Slims tennis circuit for women tennis players, and really was one of the first people to initiate a paid model for, a paid structure for women athletes. But it's very, very difficult for women to be sponsored as athletes into the early 1980s. And it's really Title IX that, because it draws so many women and girls into sport, that companies that have already been selling men's athletic gear realize that there's a massive market that's untapped. And that said, these companies tend to just use a model that is known as like shrink it and pink it. So they don't really respond to women's athletic interests, bodies, needs, concerns, and oftentimes it's women who are pioneering products themselves, which then companies become very interested in and move forward with. But like the sports bra, for example, two women athletes created that themselves because they felt that, the regular brassieres women had grown up with were just not cutting it for serious sport. And so it's really the 80s, the 90s, these periods of like big free enterprise capitalism that we start to see companies begin to invest in women's sport.
Great. Part of my job as the moderator is also to keep us on time. So, Professor,
Yep.
I'll remind us we have about 20 minutes and then a few questions at the end. So I promise all of you who have submitted questions, Cheryl, Alice, and Wendy, we're going to get to them. But why don't we move forward and then we'll stack them up at the end.
Sure. Okay, so I'll try to, I think these last slides flow together hopefully pretty smoothly, but I'll try to, Andy, not take too much of our time. So in the last phase of our talk, I want to think about a group who I call the children of Title IX. Oftentimes the women are called the daughters of Title IX, but this would be the generations who have had access to Title IX their entire lives, have grown up, never sort of feeling the agony or the pinch of life without it. So Title IX for these folks has fostered participation, empowerment, and gains. However, in this new feminist late 1990s, early 2000s space, women continue to remain very vulnerable to predation, to negative outcomes, to discrimination. And so I want to explore that. All right, so one moment that I think shows us the complexity of feminism and discrimination in the early 90s that women themselves are looking at is 1991 when EEOC attorney Anita Hill testified at the Senate hearing of Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. So when she does so, she captures the attention of many women around the country, and particularly the way that she's treated by the all-white Senate Confirmation Hearing Committee, which is captained by Joe Biden at that time. The way that she's treated by all of those men really, really stands as a kind of warning for women around the country. And you can see one grad student here wrote into her local newspaper at Columbia, "The messages I got were, do not come forward with an accusation of sexual harassment. If you were raped, do not bother coming forward because you will have to relive that rape on a witness stand where it will seem that you and not your rapist is on trial." So there are these moments that sort of kind of sear into women's consciousness. The fact that on the one hand, here's this like incredibly eloquent, accomplished woman, but she's, just being badgered, disbelieved, slandered by, this elitist room full of white men. So moving forward, there are a number of other ways that we see the complexity of Title IX and feminism as well. So one of them is the Clinton administration. So Clinton really opens up and moves forward with holding federal agencies to account on Title IX and encouraging departments to do deep investigations of their own policies, right? How are they supporting sex equality in education? And he also, I think, is genuinely interested in women's sport and, always interested in sort of performing that. And you can see him here going jogging with the 1996 U.S. Women's Olympic basketball team. And here we can see, perhaps much more organically, Chelsea Clinton playing soccer at Sidwell Friends School. All right, so moving forward, girls' sports have just spring-loaded in popularity by the late 1990s. So these are two very well-known teams, UNC and UT. But I think they just show the extent to which women's team sport, as opposed to individual sport, has become more broadly accepted. Okay, so as we sort of get to the full fruition of that, the quote 99ers are probably the apotheosis of really just the success, right, and the sort of happy excitement of Title IX. So in 1999, the U.S. women's national soccer team won the World Cup, and just the elation and the sort of identification and the happiness that millions of Americans celebrated them with, and they became just heroes for generations of girls, and for boys too, but particularly I think for girls who could now see themselves in the images of these women are really important. So for example, although she's kind of an unsung hero, right, at the time she gets much less credit than her blonde white teammate here. But the goalkeeper, Brianna Scurry, made an essential save in that game. And then the picture that made the cover of Sports Illustrated was the final penalty kicker, Brandi Chastain, who whips off her shirt after she scores. Everyone can see the sports bra. Everyone can see the muscularity and just like her absolute just passion. And it's just an absolute counter to everything that the past century had told us we had to believe about women's sport. So I think these two women are just really interesting examples of the complexity within one team. So let's see, moving forward, I think just something that I'll put out there, because I don't want to take too much, I want to make sure we're moving along. But one of the most important aspects of Title IX to be aware of is how it's been used since the 70s in sexual assault cases. So if folks are going to be treated equally on campus, they have equal rights to sexual safety. And this is why Title IX is important in sexual assault and rape cases. So in the late 1990s, there were numerous cases in which male athletes in particular raped or sexually assaulted women. Sometimes those women were athletes, sometimes not. But interestingly, Title IX often, ironically, kind of accorded these athletes the sort of support of their men's athletic departments. Oftentimes they weren't removed from school, they weren't prosecuted, and in many cases, some of them ascended to lucrative professional sport careers. So those assaults hindered their careers not in the slightest. One example of a woman who suffered this kind of situation is University of Colorado place kicker Katie Hinida, who was raped by a teammate in 1999. Okay, so just a few other examples. You can see here the infamous case of serial rapist Larry Nassar. So you can see him here, in the very famous 1996 Dream Team, Carrie Strug, who landed a vault on one foot and became a national heroine. You can see this predator, Larry Nassar, literally reaching for her right here. So we look at that very differently now. And you can see here these Olympians, Simone Biles, Allie Raceman, testifying that the FBI failed to protect them from Nassar just recently. Okay, so a few other just ways to think about this. So since the 2003-2002 spotlight crisis on Catholic sex assault of children, this has really caused a reckoning at Catholic and Jesuit colleges and universities, and Title IX has been a complex part of that. So Georgetown, and you can see here the Hoya newspaper, has really had to grapple with that. In this case, for example, of 14 priests going back years who were in those intimate spaces on campus and students exposed to them. But we've also seen just massive cases at places like Baylor. Okay, so in kind of conclusion, right, we've seen almost a kind of whiplash among presidential administrations about how expansively to interpret Title IX in cases of sexual assault. So the Obama administration expanded coverage of Title IX in these cases, whereas the Trump administration contracted it. And you can see Betsy DeVos, his Secretary of Education right here. Okay, so I mostly just have a couple images. So here we have the very recent expansion of Title IX to cover gender identity as well as sex. And I'm happy to say more about that if anyone's interested, but this was in 2020.
Yeah, Professor, we've actually had quite a few questions about that.
Okay.
So I'm going to pause.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm going to pause you and bring you back to that because Kelly, thank you for your question. Kelly's in Massachusetts. Allison, I believe you asked about it. Wendy, I think you may have mentioned it, but I think our audience is very interested in the ways that new gender identities may have either been impacted by Title IX or vice versa.
Oh, great. Sure. So I'm happy to talk about that. It's, I think, been really pivotal, both in kind of the hyper-partisan politics of our current era. Title IX and gender identity has become, a very controversial topic. And in some ways, I think targeting kids and using trans and non-binary students and queer students more broadly has been a way to kind of undercut and attack Title IX, which is disturbing. What I put together here is just a kind of composite of very different ways and hopefully very expansive ways that Americans at different levels of sport have built on the foundation of Title IX to sort of reimagine how we think about gender in sport. So just as a quick example, here we have Chris Mosier, who is a trans man and excels in men's triathlon. Here we have Kobe Bryant talking in the locker room to the woman he called the White Mamba, WNBA star Diana Taurasi. And before Bryant died, he urged Taurasi, and there were around 5 other women, he encouraged them to go out for the NBA and argued that women could and should be playing in the NBA if they had the skill and ability. So here you can see a sex-integrated team playing ultimate frisbee. You can see Serena Williams and extremely outspoken feminist Andy Murray playing doubles. Here we have non-binary track and field star Nikki Hiltz after winning a competitive event. And here we have trans non-binary athlete Laisha Clarendon playing in the WNBA. these are some different ways that athletes have chosen to represent themselves. And one thing I think is really important to make a distinction about is that these are all adults, right? And they've all been through school. They've, had that protection of Title IX. And many of the American kids, obviously, who are being targeted today at the college level, but certainly younger than that, are in a very, very vulnerable position. And I think it's very important to remember that. Also, I think it's very important to remember that youth sport is, a very distinctive and different animal than elite professional sport, and to talk about them as sort of monolithic or flattened. I think oftentimes in the political conversation that can happen, and I don't think that makes any more sense than talking about, youth sport or professional sport as one and the same in any other context. I don't think that makes sense either. Lastly, I would just say I think oftentimes there's a kind of fear in our culture, and particularly kind of politicized language, that, quote, men are going to, quote, take over women's sport, or that, like, quote, boys will win women's sports if sports become more expansive, right? And I think largely because of sexism, or the sort of specter that women, like, are worse at sports writ large. We don't oftentimes have complex conversations about what women are capable of, or what cis women are capable of, or what, any given athlete can do beyond the sort of narrow category they're put in. One person, I think, who calls us to ask us questions, our new U.S. women's soccer star, Alyssa Thompson. So she has a sister even younger than she is, and they're both in, like, the men's Major League Soccer development program. They train with a club called MLS Next, and Alyssa has just been put on the U.S. senior women's national team and is likely headed for the Women's World Cup. But she plays with boys, she tackles boys, she scores in this league, and I think she really just calls us to examine what we think that women and girls are capable of in these spaces. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that this is a very complex, important topic.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think the way that you reimagined that conversation is really helpful as well. So it's not just opportunity, but it's the ways in which perceived limitations may not be there.
I think that's right. And I think, like, listening to the athletes themselves is crucial in these conversations. And also just taking different school districts, different schools, different people on their own terms, listening to the conversations they want to have, and affording them the protections of Title IX. I think that's critical. It's crucial. It's the law.
Let's take a few questions as we begin to conclude tonight, and then we can go to your last slide as a final goodbye. This question comes in from Casey. Casey is in California and asks, if, in your opinion, do you think that sports seem to be more trans-friendly for trans males? Casey's heard a lot about the unfairness of trans women who have the advantage of male musculature.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think that, like, looking at this series of images, for example, I think that in some ways, Alyssa Thompson is a cis woman competing at the national level with women, who on her high school team, Harvard Westlake, plays with girls, even though she, sort of supersedes and crosses gender lines in her club sport. But I think she didn't, even though she's not transgressing in terms of her own gender performativity and identity and her body, those lines, I think someone like that, as well as these other folks, I think when women, I think that it again calls into sort of social presumptions about what women physiologically, mentally, emotionally are capable of in the sports space, because we do have women who excel when they're put into, like, the clinically and classically defined, quote, male categories, and certainly maybe not the majority or maybe not all, but when we have someone like significant players in men's professional sport, like arguing that like our league will be strengthened if we include women, right? I think that's interesting, and I think it's important to consider. I think there is still considerable prejudice that's very profound and really affects people's lives and mental health, whether in sport, whether it's athletes who, are going male to female or female to male.
Right.
That because of like presumptions of, again, about like the physiology, that there, I think it is possible that there may be sort of less of a specter of fear, or less of a sort of fear of a kind of like takeover than for female to male interests and
Right.
in men's sport.
Right. This question comes from Sarah. Sarah's in New Jersey at the Petty School, and asks this question: despite the gains that you've documented and we've seen, women still receive less airtime on networks like ESPN, not including ESPNW, and professional leagues in general have been hard to sustain. Do you sense that this paradigm is going to shift?
I think we're maybe at a flashpoint for it right now, but yeah, women receive between 4 and 5% of the media coverage in the sports space. It's like absolutely abysmal. So, and I think for us to really flesh out conversations about, if you build it, they will come. I think like women need to be given access to media, right? And we need to showcase women. We need to give them advertising dollars. They need more sponsorships. Right, and we need to put them on mainstream channels. So maybe not shunt it off into. I mean, I'm an ESPNW fan, but what about ESPN proper? I think that like women need to be getting time on Fox Sports. They need to be on prime time in order for them to be sort of exposed to a mainstream audience as opposed to a niche audience of people who are diehard women's sports fans. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a hugely exciting growth market. And one place we've seen that is with, like, for example, the women's National Women's Soccer League, despite just like a massive sexual assault crisis that the league is going through right now, largely due to like sexism and, just sort of intense discrimination and homophobia. Despite all of that, the league is bringing in just like massive viewership numbers and growing. I think like their growth rate was 70% from like in the past several years of TV viewership. And this is in a league that only can get like within every couple of games, it's like a different streaming channel will agree to show them. Like there isn't one centralized place where the fan or the viewer can even go to watch the games, and still, there's a growth market there. So I think it's it's an increasingly viable space, and it's more exposure will only bring more prosperity, I think.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for the question, Sarah. This question comes from Allison. Allison is at Santa Rosa Junior College and wonders if you could talk some about some key lawsuits like the Brown University gymnastics team or women's Olympic marathon. And she mentions one about perhaps women ski jumpers. She has a friend she mentions named Jacqueline Hansen who led some battles for the women's Olympic marathon and ski jumpers. Do you have any background on some of those key lawsuits?
That's super interesting. I mean, I think the case with Brown and gymnastics in the 90s, right? I think that's a classic example of a case in which there is a university program that wants to cut a women's sport to save money, and so that it can support what it considers to be its more prestigious men's sports. Or to like tighten the purse strings a little bit. And what they found and what women were able to use to successfully sue to reinstate the team is that you have to support the interests and continuing abilities of athletes at your school. And for a gymnastics team that excelled at that level, Brown was forced to concede in that case. So I do think, though, it takes the tenacity, it takes the willingness to sort of withstand incredible media pressure and oftentimes sort of hate from people who do, want to see the sort of like in a lot of cases it's football, but like pushback from boosters, pushback from sort of executives. Like it's a really sort of brave, but also, like a risk space to bring those suits.
Right. Right. Thank you. This question comes from Melissa. Melissa's in nearby Durham, North Carolina. She asks this. Was it a logical extension of Title IX to be the law designed to investigate and prosecute sexual assaults? Do you think that this new entity of the law took money and personnel away from an athletic focus on college campuses?
I don't. And the reason, I think, is because one thing that has come out of it is something that colleges should have been doing all along, which is that to sort of support and process just the litany of sexual assault reports that have come through, sort of more and more frequently since the 70s. Schools have increasingly created offices, like Title IX offices on their campuses, and hired Title IX coordinators to sort of give more attention and support on campus to people who bring Title IX complaints. And previously, in past decades, before a lot of schools sort of took it upon themselves to follow the law and have those offices on campus, sort of like HR offices, but devoted strictly to Title IX. A lot of the time, athletic departments preferred to take care of these issues in-house, basically, and avoided, sort of going outside the athletic corridors at all in order to sort of curtail publicity, to sort of spare athletes if athletes were accused of any kind of media, any kind of, accountability. And I think that sort of expanding in the public consciousness and in terms of student knowledge about what Title IX can be used for, I think that that's been a net positive for campuses. And in terms also, I think of people anywhere on campus, like an employee, for example, being treated unequally in a service position on campus, right? Or like a professor or someone like a secretary who's facing sex discrimination on campus. Those are all Title IX issues. So I think the more holistically and expansively any given school can think about Title IX, it shouldn't divert attention or dollars from one area of campus to another. It should increase the sort of focus and enforcement, ideally.
Last question for the night, Professor. Talk to us about what you think the metrics of success will be. How do we know when Title IX has reached its full potential?
Right, that's a great question. I'm not sure that. I think that in order to eradicate sex discrimination in college campus, or in campus environments writ large, we need to see, really sort of revolutionary progress in broader society and politics. But I do think that because Title IX, affects almost every school in the country, that's such an exciting foundational place to start. And I think that when, maybe a good sort of barometer would be, when folks on campuses feel comfortable reporting and sharing experiences that they've had that make them uncomfortable or that seem gender inappropriate. But then we also have accountability, and fair treatment and sort of fair consideration and responsibility taken for, for violation of the law. And we see schools actually doing that and, acting on Title IX, and then the government, the federal government, coming in, actually supporting those cases. So we never have another Larry Nassar moment where every single institution failed those girls. I think that will be where, we can maybe say, well, this is a metric of progress, right? Where the institutions actually do their jobs and they function effectively, because we're not there yet. And I think if we can get there, then we have a potential to change society in a broader sense.
And I've got one last question for you. Have you voted yet?
I have not, but I'm I'm very excited to do so. So thank you, Andy. And I wanted to end with a picture of Patsy Mink. So that's actually a perfect transition because the law was named after her the year that she died in 2002. So it's now officially known as the Title IX Equal Opportunity in Education Act. So, but yeah, I'm excited to vote. So thank you for asking.
And Blaschke, thank you so much for joining us, and join me in reminding everyone in our audience to make sure you vote. We've got about another week to go, and please get out there at the ballot box. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar series. Please do follow us on our various social media threads to see upcoming activities and opportunities for professional development. That includes our next webinar. Just 2 nights from now, I'll be joined by a duo, actually. Scott Denham from Davidson College and Barbara Mann from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America will be joining me to discuss why teaching Maus, the graphic novel Maus, matters now more than ever. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow. I hope to see you Thursday night. If I don't, I'll see you next week on the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.